what does this guy have to do with this character, this character, this character, or this character? In some ways, a lot. In others, not really so much. In today's video, I'm going to talk about the very confusing and complicated background of Miracleman, or Marvelman, whichever you prefer to call him. So, why is he confusing, you ask? Over the years, many comic creators have claimed ownership, partial ownership, licensing rights, trademark rights, gave away their ownership, and never really owned him at all. So that's what I want to talk about, just why the background of this character is so confusing. I will be mentioning it, but I will not talk about the lawsuit between Neil Gaiman and Todd McFarlane. That's worth a series unto itself. And anyway, the folks over at Cartoonist Kayfabe have already covered that. And if you're interested, I suggest you hop over to their channel, and a link will be in the description. Now, most of us can probably agree that this comic here, Action Comics #1, published in April of 1938 by National Periodicals, the company that would eventually become DC Comics, introducing Superman, pretty much launched the whole superhero genre. I know I don't have to go too much into just who Superman is. An alien as an infant, crash lands on Earth, becomes an omnipotent being, looks human, and hides among the populace by wearing a pair of glasses. With the creation of Superman, various companies and creators were scrambling to create their superpowered being to put on the market. Which brings us to this character, Captain Marvel. Not that Captain Marvel. This Captain Marvel, who made his first appearance in Whiz Comics #2, published February 1940 by the now defunct Fawcett Comics. Billy Batson, young boy, says a magic word, Shazam, and turns into the world's mightiest mortal. For simplicity reasons, I'm going to refer to this character for now on in this video as Shazam. Shazam began to outsell Superman by a substantial margin, and National Periodicals, DC Comics, felt that Shazam was a little too much of a copy of Superman and filed a lawsuit, starting in September of 1941 and lasting for the next 12 years. During this period, Shazam was getting really popular across the ocean in the UK, with black and white reprints published by UK's own L.M. Miller and Son. By the 1950s, superheroes had lost a lot of their popularity, and being which, Fawcett decided to settle with DC Comics out of court and cease publication with Shazam. This ended the reprints that were going on in the UK. So L. Miller and Son, with comic creator Mick Angelo, created their own version of Shazam, Marvelman. Mike Moron says the magic word Komoda, that's atomic backwards, and turns into the superpowered being Marvelman. Now, I want to say there's not a lot of originality here. They pretty much copied and pasted Shazam into the Marvelman character, with the exception of having blonde hair and a blue suit. Marvelman would have a pretty good print run, lasting from 1954 to 1963, but sales began to quickly decrease, with Marvel Comics being sold across the ocean. Marvelman would eventually cease, and L. Miller and Sons would completely fold in 1966. Now, during this period, Marvel Comics, before anyone else could jump on board with their character, creates their Captain Marvel with Marvel Superheroes issue 12, 1967. This character would go through a number of characterizations and costumes until finally settling on its current status of Carol Danvers, formerly Miss Marvel, not that Miss Marvel, this Miss Marvel, formerly Miss Marvel, and this seems to be popular, so she's probably going to be around for a while. Marvelman would lay dormant for nearly 20 years until Quality, a British comic book company, would launch Warrior in 1982. Warrior was a black and white science fiction fantasy anthology magazine with the intent of Marvelman being its flagship character. Now, with the production of Warrior, there were a lot of moving parts, so I'm only going to cover what I feel like are going to be the main points. Marvelman in Warrior was going to have a much more darker approach than it had in the past, and the stories were going to be more a reflection of what was going on at that time. Also, the creative direction for Marvelman was up-and-coming comic book superstar Alan Moore. It's also worth mentioning that in Warrior, that Alan Moore, with artist David Lloyd, would be serializing V for Vendetta. Yes, that V, the one whose Guy Fawkes mask got really popular with the movie that came out more than 20 years later. But it would be the publication of this magazine, Marvelman Special, that caused Quality to catch the wrath of Marvel Comics. Marvel felt that having Marvel in the magazine title was an infringement on the company's name. So a cease and desist letter was sent to Quality. This infuriated Alan Moore to the point who was working freelance for Marvel UK, stating that he would never work for Marvel again, and with the exception of providing an introduction to a Captain Britain collection of his work, he's pretty much kept his word. After issue 21, Marvelman was removed from Warrior, and 5 issues later, Warrior ceased publication. Shortly after this, Marvelman was licensed out to American comic book company Eclipse Comics. And in August of 1985, Eclipse began reprinting material from Warrior in a comic book format and colored. This would provide the first 6 issues. Also, to avoid any complications at all from Marvel Comics, Marvelman would be renamed Miracleman. And I'll be referring to this character as Miracleman for the remainder of this video. Alan Moore would be brought back in to continue the story he started, but by this time he was writing Swamp Thing monthly for DC Comics and would work on Miracleman in between his commitments over at DC. Also, his Swamp Thing collaborators Rick Veit and John Tobbleton, would be joining him. New material would be provided on issue number 7 and would continue on through issue 16, including the controversial childbirth issue. Now, on the topic of ownership, because that's what a big part of this video is. I'm not sure how this was decided, but Eclipse owned 2/3 of the character, and 1/3 of the character was split between the writer and the artist. After Alan Moore was done with Miracleman, he was ready to move on, and he offered up his share of the character to up-and-coming superstar Neil Gaiman, where he and artist Mark Buckingham took over the character. They had planned for 3 story arcs, each consisting of 6 issues, called The Golden Age, The Silver Age, and The Dark Age, to wrap up the complete series. They were able to complete The Golden Age, which consisted of issues 17 through 22, which was launched in June of 1990. And I would like to take note that at this time, Neil Gaiman was involved with writing Sandman for DC Comics, so like Alan Moore before, he was working on Miracleman in between his DC commitments. And it's also worth mentioning that covers for the Golden Age issues was provided by Dave McKean, a frequent collaborator of Neil Gaiman, and who was also doing the covers for Sandman. After the completion of the Golden Age, Neil Gaiman and Mark Buckingham worked on this series, Miracleman Apocrypha, which was a 3-issue series where they did the introduction and other comic book writers and artists provided stories in an anthology style. And I like to take note, one of these artists was superstar painter Alex Ross, who was just getting his start. After the Miracleman Apocrypha was done, they began working on the Silver Age, which issues 23 and 24 saw print, and covers were provided by artist Barry Windsor Smith. Unfortunately, Eclipse would fold and Miracleman would once again fall into obscurity. So just a little recap on the claim of ownership of Miracleman. Quality Comics, the publisher of Warrior, claimed ownership. Eclipse is claiming ownership. Contributing creators have claimed ownership, in which Alan Moore has given his away. So the ownership of Miracleman is already a bit of a mess, but it's about to get more complicated. In 1996, Spawn creator Todd McFarlane purchased Eclipse properties in an auction for $25,000, believing Miracleman was part of the acquisition. Like I said, I'm not going to go into the court case between Neil Gaiman and Todd McFarlane, but just bring up some points when I feel like I need to. And by this time, trouble was already brewing between the two with their work on the Angela character. So just to add another layer, Todd McFarlane now has claim of ownership. And in 2002, Neil Gaiman sued Todd McFarlane over unauthorized use. And then this would drag on a court case that would go on for roughly 12 years. Now, when exactly Marvel decided it wanted to get involved with reprinting Miracleman and why, I'm not entirely sure, but they did. And in 2002, Neil Gaiman wrote 1602 for Marvel, and that's exactly what it is, Marvel Universe in the year 1602, with the profits going to help pay for the court costs Neil Gaiman was having with Todd McFarlane. Now, to throw another curveball into the whole ownership issue, in 2009, it became clear that Mick Angelo, remember him, the creator of Marvel Man, had ownership of the character all along. And then later that year at San Diego Comic-Con, Marvel had announced it had purchased ownership of Marvel Man from Mick Angelo, thus clearing up any ownership issues. And in 2014, Marvel began releasing redigitized versions of the Miracleman reprints. It also is worth mentioning, to avoid any complications with Alan Moore, the issues that Alan Moore had worked on was recredited as the original writer. And then Alan Moore went on to state that any royalties he would receive from Marvel from the Miracleman reprints, he was going to donate to Mick Angelo. After the Alan Moore issues were complete, they reprinted the Golden Age that Neil Gaiman and Mark Buckingham had completed. And then they advertised for the Silver Age, showing the 2 issues that had seen print. But for some undisclosed reason, complications once again arose and Miracleman was put on hold. So that concludes today's video. According to a web source, in December of 2021, Mark Buckingham has completed 4 more issues of the Silver Age. All I can do is wait and see. And also, if you're interested in reading the Marvel Man issues from the 1950s, Marvel Comics has published several reprint volumes of that. Just be warned, they're a little dated, so don't get any of those expecting what you would read from Alan Moore and Neil Gaiman. And also I want to make it clear again, if you're interested in the court case between Neil Gaiman and Todd McFarlane, the folks over at Cartoonist Kayfabe did a reconstruction of the deficit between the two, so there will be a link to that if you're interested. And I just find it pretty ironic that DC Comics owns the character that they sued because they felt it was too much of a similarity to Superman, and Marvel Comics now owns the character that they felt was too much of an infringement of their name. Anyway, you know the drill. Like and subscribe and leave comments. Again, as I've stated, I'm new at this. I'm still learning, and I'm willing to take any suggestions. And also, if I've left anything out, feel free to leave that in as well. Thank you for stopping by, and I will see you the next time. Since preparing this video, there's some updates that has happened. Now, some time ago I read that in June, Marvel had announced that it was going to start releasing new issues of Miracleman, the Silver Age, starting in October. Well, I had heard news like this before over the last few years, and nothing came about it due to legal issues still involved. But I went to my local comic shop and saw Miracleman number 0 on the rack. Inside has some new pages by Mark Buckingham and Neil Gaiman, but also a house ad advertising Miracleman the Silver Age with a few preview pages of what's to come. So it's actually happening. So that's why I was a little skeptical of hearing the news earlier. And I hope there's no more delays, because there's still another story arc to be done after the Silver Age for this whole series to wrap up. Thank you for stopping by.